Afternoon. Can I say welcome to members and invited guests, both in the public gathering here and watching on webcast, today's meeting of the Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter using @London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using #London Assembly Regeneration. Our main topic of discussion is the social regeneration of neighbourhoods. But first, I have a few short items of formal business I need to go through before we get to our guest. Please can I ask you to make sure your electronic devices are at least turned to silent, if not turned off altogether. Can I start by asking the clerk if we have any apologies for this meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. There are no apologies.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note recommendations set out in item 2?
Noted.
Can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest or any other relevant interests? Okay, moving on.
Noted.
Can we confirm the minutes of our last meeting held on the 4th of July 2018?
Yes.
Can we note the report and the progress on its actions?
Noted.
Noted. We now move to our main item, focusing on social regeneration of neighbourhoods, in particular North Kensington. I'd just like to introduce our guests. Councillor Kim Taylor-Smith, Doug Goldring, James Campbell, and Louise Duggan. How are you? I didn't say that most of you are all from Kensington and Chelsea. Have I given someone a title they don't? No, I haven't.
It's Campbell.
Well,
rather than Campbell. I've been called worse.
James, I apologise profusely. Excuse me. I blame my short-sightedness there. As is tradition in our committees, I, as the chair, will ask the first question. And because we have so many members, most of our questions will direct to a particular person. But if you have a dying issue that you think we've missed, please do come in. But in the interest of brevity, we'll try and focus on who we think could give us the answer. So our opening question will be this. How did you develop and agree the 10 key principles? Have these come from residents? Let's start with Councillor Taylor-Smith.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting us today. Just by way of explanation, we have our Director of Housing and also the gentleman who's in charge of our Lancaster West estate. And my specific responsibility is obviously housing and obviously the regeneration of Grenfell. May I also start by saying we were anticipating to have somebody who would be able to talk about care support today.
Yep.
But we don't have an officer who's here who's able to attend for care support, so I will endeavour to try and answer the question to the extent that I can't. I'm very happy to give a written answer to those questions.
Sorry, any answer you feel like you cannot provide, we will just have it in writing.
It might be better for me to refer it and do it as a written reply. That's acceptable.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, in terms of the 10, I don't. Can I just get borrow your 10 principles? Sorry. How do we develop?
Please, Doug, if you feel you're better placed, please do come.
I was just going to turn around and say, I think it is better that actually Doug does cover that set.
If you like. So it was quite clear in the context of the Grenfell Tower tragedy that resident engagement was something which absolutely needed to take place, and that the refurbishment would need to be resident-led. As a result, the Lancaster West neighbourhood team agreed with the Lancaster West Residents Association, which represents the 795 households on the estate, talked about those 10 key principles which you've seen. They're very much overarching aims of the refurbishment programme, and they were really to try and give some assurance to residents, and also, if you like, something set in stone that they could hold the council to account over, given the tragedy that occurred and its aftermath, and to be fair, the experience of housing management for the Grenfell Tower fire. It was quite clear that being seen to listen and act was pivotal. And I think what you see in those 10 principles is exactly that, and that any refurbishment work needs to be done sensitively in cooperation with residents rather than done to them.
What level of involvement did residents have in finalising these 10 key?
So the Residents Association worked with our staff on the estate and actually co-wrote this with us. So these were the things that they felt they wanted to see in there, and they took that to their wider group and got it signed off. So that's my understanding at the time. This was done prior to at the start of the refurbishment discussions, before we then moved to the next stage.
How representative is the residents group? Is it very active? Is it a large residents group?
I think, again, given that the context we're operating in, unsurprisingly, the Residents Association meetings are easily amongst the best attended I've seen, and I know only been working at Lancaster West for 4.5 months now. But prior to that, we're talking probably 60% of households represented. I mean, it was literally standing room only. In terms of the diversity, and I know we're going to talk about diversity later, but I would say it's extremely representative of the various community groups. But interestingly, Lancaster West is quite a complex estate in terms of tenure. We have shared owners, we have temporary accommodation residents, obviously general needs tenants, leaseholders who live on the estate, leaseholders who don't live on the estate. And what's positive is both the committee and the general meetings reflect that complexity.
Over what period of time were these 10 statements refined down to the final 10? Just roughly.
It was very much an iterative process.
Yeah.
A colleague, my predecessor, led on this, so I haven't got the specifics. But to give you a flavour of how we're doing things, we go every week to the Residents Association committee meetings where they invite us. So on a weekly basis we have those discussions. So in the spirit of how we're working now, I would imagine you'd be talking a number of weeks. There would be some back and forth, and as you can see, they're quite plain English, they're quite tangible, and I think that's a reflection of really listening to what's important to residents.
At what point do you expect as the council, the residents, to hold you to account for these 10 principles?
On a daily basis, to be honest with you.
So these principles now are ongoing?
Absolutely, and I think it's fair to say, in terms of shaping the Lancaster West neighbourhood team as a housing office, if you like, we've embodied that in a number of ways. All frontline staff, when we recruit them, residents are involved as much as they want to be on the panel. So there's 2 residents on my own panel. So no frontline members of staff are appointed without residents being satisfied that they've had the opportunity to be engaged. So that's just in terms of formulating the team. In terms of advertising and recruiting, we've done that in a different way than a typical council approach. So we've used community organisations, we've gone back to putting notices on local notice boards saying we're looking for a new repairs team. So we're having people come in and out, and I think we're based literally underneath the estate, one of the 3 walkway blocks, which is attached to the tower and Grenfell Walk. So physically, we are amongst the community. We try and be as accessible and, if you like, as porous as we can be. And increasingly, where we've been recruiting a workforce that reflects the community, we've been able to have conversations with people, which I hope are starting to give people some assurance that we are embodying these 10 commitments.
But before I pass you on to my colleague, Navin Shah, my final question is this. To what extent are other residents, other social tenants in RBKC receiving the same principles? Are these now universal for the council, or is it just here in Lancaster West?
No, these are just for Lancaster West at the present moment in time. We have taken on the management of the overall housing stock. The management of Lancaster West came back prior to that. It came back in September of last year. We've put in a model of delivery at Lancaster West, which we hope to learn from, and we have a number of resident groups set up where we are discussing the future housing management arrangements, but also the level of service that they would wish to see and how that may be delivered. So we expect to take some of that learning and be able to extrapolate that across our stock.
Can I just add to that? Obviously, when we bought, when the housing management was effectively given back to us on the 1st of March, it was done so under a commitment that what would happen would be very much resident-led and with residents at the heart of that. And we immediately started a process, both of reinstating all the meetings that had had and actually extending that to give the residents the opportunity to come down, come and hold us to account in terms of what we were doing on a day-to-day management of their housing. But most importantly, to create an independent, resident-driven panel in terms of assessing how they would wish to future engage with us and also how they'd want their housing management to be done. And that's proved to be very successful. They selected we used deliberately an independent firm of consultants who would actually manage that process to ensure that residents felt that they were getting heard. And it, from beyond, obviously from the council and the council officers. And that's a process that's in place at the moment. And Lancaster West is one of what could be a number of models that we could look for the wider estates within the Royal Borough. There are lots of models. A lot of people just want to remain the housing to be managed by the council, but some people are looking at the model very much as how Lancaster West is currently run. But at the time, we felt it was very important to put on the ground people on the estate themselves in order to develop those close bonds and liaise with the local residents, which you can't do obviously remotely when you're looking at all the estates within the borough.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass you on to Logan.
I think it's Tony.
I think it's me, actually.
Excuse me, Tony.
Good afternoon, gentlemen and lady. I'm not sure who wants to answer, but the question is, will the principles be accompanied by measurable targets so that residents can know how you are meeting these principles, please?
Absolutely, and we're in the process of reviewing a suite of performance indicators, key performance indicators. So the, if you like, typical things that you see in housing management in terms of satisfaction with housing services, satisfaction with being listened and heard, satisfaction with repairs. We're in the process now of introducing what I believe are a more sophisticated method of measuring those. Historically, KCTMO measured its satisfaction surveys in-house. In my view, I think the housing sector is best placed not to do that, otherwise it could stand accused of marking its own homework, if you like. So we're in the process of developing those with an independent third-party provider, and rather than just relying on postal feedback, looking at using text messages, phone calls and other digital solutions. There's more qualitative measures, if you like, which certainly are being embodied at the moment. Following the development of the principles, we've held two significant engagement days. We call them Ideas Days on the estate. Again, I would say well over 50% of all households were represented, over 500 people. At both of those days, they were again extremely successful. And in terms of Lancaster West, for those that know this, I apologise, but it's an extremely diverse estate in terms of its architecture. The earliest building is around 1930, exactly 1930. The oldest one is 1980. So that diversity means that from a stock point of view, there are particular challenges to refurbishment, but also, as with social housing across the country, it's the people as well who are experiencing a number of challenges. So we found it important to ensure that at the fortnightly refurbishment steering group, residents are well represented. Again, that is an open invitation to any resident who wishes to attend. And in terms of some of the measures, we're at the stage now where we have just opened our first demonstration flat. And what we have done there is, unlike a show flat, we have stripped it back to the brick so that residents themselves, who aren't experts in refurbishment or regeneration, can see the challenges that we will face as a landlord, if you like. The key to co-design is that any information we have is also available to residents. And I'm pleased to say in the week that we held the demonstration flat open, we had 76 attendants from those blocks with that archetype out of 360 households. So again, very high levels of engagement. We had 186 pieces of feedback. which are all helping us to shape as we go along what the priorities need to be on a block-by-block basis.
Thank you, that's really helpful. To take one example in terms of principle translation into action, maybe Principle 7, for example, could you explain how you ensure that the residents will benefit from new jobs and training, please?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, developing a workforce reflective of the community is something which I think in many, well, in all in the London context is absolutely vital. In terms of the neighbourhood team, there's about 25 of us, including myself. About 8 of those are repairs operatives. I've mentioned before about how we've engaged and advertised with community groups. We've adopted a more flexible approach to recruiting as well in terms of the core hours that people can work. So that has helped, for example, a young single mother from a BME group work with us where otherwise she wouldn't have been able to take up that opportunity. So I'm pleased to say, given the estate is around 80% black and minority ethnic residents, we've recruited of that 25. We have 3 Somali colleagues, we have an Iranian colleague, and we have 2 Moroccan colleagues as well who've started with us. And 3 of those are residents of the estate, and another 3 are residents of the nearby Silchester estate. So we've started to embody that. And the reason why that's important, even though we're talking about refurbishment, is that starts to build the trust that we will do the things you've told us that are important. Because if we don't do that, then people will say, you're just talking about local jobs, why aren't you doing it now? So that's been pivotal, and that's something we've started to bring to life.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Just to finally, in terms of managing expectations, could you just give me a bit of an idea about the timescale for this? What is a very lengthy process? Everybody that's in regeneration knows regeneration is not quick.
So at the moment, we've had the feedback from the ideas days, and they are being costed up, and we suspect there will be a crunch time coming up pretty soon in terms of what we've got in terms of resources and what the expectations are. So I suspect we will have a discussion then around whether we can close that gap by leveraging in additional resources or changing what we are going to deliver. We expect that to be completed by the end of this calendar year, so the next 3 months or so. And then after that, we will then work with. Then there's a process of a procurement and using residents in involving them in procurement, and then overseeing the work on site and so on and so forth. So we don't expect. We've told residents we don't expect to really be on site doing any of the major works until next summer at the earliest.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. One question.
Question 4.
Nikki. It's Nikki.
Nikki, sorry.
This is for Louise, our GLA representative here. Could you tell me how there's a lot of emphasis in regeneration now on integrating material and social, the material and social together objectives, and I'm just wondering whether you can give us some examples of where it's been integrated, linked in successfully in schemes in London.
Well, I guess thanks for the question and thanks for having me this afternoon. It's a really interesting and challenging context that we're examining here. And I guess that's the first comment to make. It's a unique context. It's a very distinct event that has led to responses being required. I can talk briefly about a couple of things that we've done within the Regen team over the last 12 months working within the area. One of those is focused on the business community and the impact of the fire on businesses in the local area. Many of them SMEs, many of them led by people from BAME backgrounds. And so there has been the Business Continuity Fund, which was done in coordination with colleagues in RBKC.
Sorry, where? Sorry, say that again.
The Business Continuity Fund that was set up in response to the fire, well, it was set up in response to the terror attack, but it was adapted to be deployed in K&C. It looked at the immediate impact on small businesses of the fire, businesses that were either in the shadow or were actually within the Lancaster estate, and they were part of the cordon, so there were direct immediate impacts on them. And the figures I have here say that there was £178,000 made available for that fund, and 26 different awards have been made to help. And I know that that's not talking immediately about necessarily community in a residential context, but it does talk about the local business community and supporting them immediately.
Yeah, it's part of the fabric, the social fabric, isn't it?
Yes.
The economic fabric, yes.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's something that we saw in Borough, we saw back in 2011, insurance processes taking a long time to come through, and therefore needing to have a direct bit of financial support that can help people to weather that storm. The Regen team has been working with the Westway Trust since last summer, and again in coordination with colleagues from RBKC. They made an application to the Good Growth Fund to...
Can you just say, what is the Westway Trust?
The Westway Trust is the trust that was set up in the 1970s to manage 23 hectares of land underneath the elevated, the Westway. Mm-hmm. So they are, colleagues here probably know more of the detail than I do, but they were set up to represent the community and to look after that land with a kind of aspiration that it would be managed in a way for the community interest. They had come to us with a specific development proposal. The application was, I think, about a month after Grenfell had happened, and we took the view that actually the most important thing to do in this context was to take time and invest time, but also to build relationships, because the last thing we wanted to do was go in with a knee-jerk response, be seen to make something happen, but for that not to reflect the aspirations of the local community. So since then, we've been working with colleagues, as I said, from the Council and from Westway Trust to define a process that would allow a strategic approach to the management of all that land, because it's an asset held in trust for the community, and to coordinate the two main landowners being the Westway Trust and K&C, and to develop a coordinated strategy for how that space is managed, improved, updated in response to what contemporary community aspirations are. So
sounds very, I'm listening carefully, but it sounds very abstract.
Sorry, let me make it a bit more concrete.
Yeah, make it more concrete.
The idea is we're given some funding to allow them to do a study that will set out a strategy for all the land holdings across those 23 hectares, that will in turn allow them to access good growth funding in round 3, so next summer, to unlock specific projects in that area.
And will these projects come from the residents?
That's exactly the point I was getting to. So instead of rushing something through last summer, we thought that it was really important that the time was taken to build a process that would allow it to be not only to take account of resident views, but actually to be defined and driven by those views. And the stage that we're at right now is that a commission has gone out. We have worked across ourselves, Westway and RBKC, to define a process that's very much a co-design process, if you like, so that the local community, and I mean, business and resident community, are part of defining, the priorities and identifying opportunities, and then seeking funding from the Good Growth Fund or any other funder to deliver those projects. So those are the kind of two main responses that our team has been involved in the GLA. Speaking about examples across London where the integration of the social and the physical has been is exemplary, is harder, because every instance that you point out, people can contest. But what I can say is in the last 2 years there's been a concerted effort to understand better the how processes of engagement or how processes of regeneration can actually begin to be measured and examined in terms of the social impact. So, for instance, up in Tottenham, where we've been, working for some time, in the last 2 years, they've developed a Regen Charter. And the idea there being that it was a shift in the framing of Tottenham as a place of need into a place where developers who had and I'm paraphrasing an officer here, who had the great honour of being allowed to develop in Tottenham would sign up to all these wider regen objectives that were established and agreed in collaboration with the community. And so I think that's an interesting example where you can talk about the delivering over a long term of bricks and mortar, essentially, but that you can leverage that process to generate opportunities for the local community in terms of jobs, in terms of the training opportunities, in terms of the give back around investment in local green spaces and local community assets. And I think that's quite an interesting methodology, that it doesn't have to be overcomplicated, but can really link the physical and the social dimensions of regen.
How, just in terms of, because part of the question is where it's been done successfully.
Yep.
And it's very much work in progress, isn't it, Tottenham?
Absolutely.
I mean, how many years now? 2, 3?
Well, I mean,
not been going
2011, I mean, in response to the riots was when things really got scaled up there. But I think in terms of the actual delivery, I'd say, things began to get more defined from about 2014 till now. So I'd say it's been 4 years of concerted effort. And that's obviously hit bumps along the way as well. So
yeah, and this committee's looked at the Olympics and the impact of the convergence concept.
Yes.
And I just wonder if you've got anything to say about that, because that really did try, didn't it, to make sure that physical regeneration was actually integrated and that it lifted the lives of people in the neighbourhood. So you didn't just create a gilded enclave.
No.
I'm just wondering whether you've got, I'm just trying to,
well,
if you could just give us another example of something
I guess
successful.
In the context of the Olympics, I think it's quite interesting how examining the edges of the place where you're intervening in is really important to make it porous, to make it so understanding what the impact of that major, that is major investment on a scale that is hard to compare. Understanding how that impacts on the edge and how the edge of that physical space is made porous and allows opportunities for residents, for businesses to not only physically access these new facilities, but also to make something for themselves, like for small businesses to have opportunities. So I think, again, thinking about Fish Island, the kind of planning framework that was established there was quite interesting in terms of ensuring that space for SMEs was maintained, and also that some of the distinctive physical fabric of that space was protected. I mean, these weren't the things that you would normally think of as heritage assets, but they are, the industrial heritage assets, if you like, of that part of the world. So that's another interesting example. I think some of the work that OPDC, the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, are doing in terms of trying to being within a particular place and having the planning powers for that particular area, but then understanding how you're a good neighbour, and so how they're working across boundaries. And there's some interesting work happening across boundaries with Harlesden and with Hammersmith and Fulham, looking at the parks and green spaces there. And I think when there are big processes of regeneration, being really, really attentive to the edges and being attentive to the opportunities, small and big, around those edges that allow existing communities to access some of the opportunities.
Yes, okay, I can say, the only thing I would say from listening to what you're talking about is that the social element is not very prominent.
Yes.
And a lot of it is, I can see, you know, that putting money into parks and green spaces and so on, as long as it's done in collaboration and so on, can build social capital, social networks and so on. But I would just say that we're not, the examples aren't leaping out at me, although they're examples of good economic input. But
yeah, and I guess I'm not making myself clear enough in the sense that, you know, in the context of the Harlesden collaboration across OPDC boundary, what you're seeing is, I guess, a larger scale process being leveraged by a town centre that's on an edge, that hasn't had a lot of attention in the past, that has social challenges and issues. And they're able to, you know, I think a good example of where a better resource team is supporting a less well-resourced team to develop things. And that ranges from town centre strategies and engaging with neighbourhood forums, but it also includes things like developing a strategy for the canal, which is a major kind of edge in that part of the world, and seeing how small organisations like local canoeing clubs and different really micro, small-scale organisations can be supported to leverage that bigger scale change that is happening. I'm not sure if that...
Can I just say, we're going to have to move on, but just intervene. I think some of the comparisons are tricky.
Yeah.
The scale of the Olympic Park and the scale of the OPDC are not relevant to Lancaster West. And Lancaster West is the complete difference to those places because it's the middle. It's not...
Yes.
Lancaster West is, in and of itself, a destination for the people who live there. And I think what's missing from your models around the social development is when you physically do a place like King's Cross, the social development doesn't actually come from King's Cross, it comes from everybody coming into it. So some of the development for Lancaster West actually is about helping the residents gain employment elsewhere, be involved in other things, because whatever happens, they'll always be coming back to Lancaster West. The issue is, what are they bringing back when they come back? You know, it's very easy to do an Olympic Park and everybody rush in because it's great in the Olympic Park and they're bringing their resource. When you talk about regenerating people, Lancaster West people are wanting better employment, better education, you know, better training. Not all of that needs to happen on Lancaster West physically, but it can start from there. So who is integrating with the residents and saying, look, these are the opportunities available in all of London. We will help you find those, not just the few that we can generate here. Because with the best will in the world, the regeneration of the estate won't provide enough employment for the people on the estate who need that. And I think that needs to be part of your reckoning whenever the GLA does anything. It isn't just about that point. It's about how does that point link to other places, the Royal Docks, the city, wherever. And then you get to regenerate the people, not so much the physical space. But enough from me.
Can I just ask Robert what he...
Go ahead, Nick.
Robert, could you tell us a bit more about how...
Robert's not here.
He's not here?
No, Robert's not here.
Oh, I didn't write. Somebody in place of Robert?
Oh, sorry.
No, there's nobody in place of Robert.
Right, okay, go on, ask the question. There's nobody who can talk about how we're going to do the integration in, you
The
know...
officers can, yes, and
Yes.
a deputy
There is a
leader can.
recovery plan.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, there is a recovery plan, yes.
Yes, well, if you could talk to us about the way, in fact, Sean's just said a bit about it, but the way you see the social and the material, as it's called, or physical, linked in, actually integrated. And I don't think we've heard enough about the social. I think even what Sean said is, although it has an impact on the social, it's very much about the economic lifting of the residents. And of course that does lead, I think, to stronger social capital and so on. But I just think we ought to talk a bit more about pure social things.
Okay. Well, I think just come back, just to add in terms of business support, because we're very grateful for the GLS support that we had. In total, I mean, there was I think it was £500,000 of support that we gave to businesses directly affected by the fire. But I think going back to your question is that one initiative that we're doing is that from the very early stages, immediate aftermath, there were a lot of people coming to us requiring support and facilities and space that, in order to create their own initiatives to support the tragedy. And what we did is we commissioned first of all an immediate community asset review, where we could work out all the assets that could be made available, not just only the assets owned by the council, but also by third parties that could be made available for all walks of support, including business support, etc. What we, having identified physical assets, we then commissioned local people to actually set it up as almost a skills audit rather than just an asset review, is to look at the skills that they had within the local community and also what the needs of that local community were as well. And that's an ongoing process going on at the moment. So we could better support and link that back in to the physical assets in terms of providing social support.
Okay. Can you tell me something about what's been done with and for young people?
Well, young people, as I say, there are a number of very good organisations within North Kensington that we obviously provide support to, who do a lot of initiatives, and those are just ongoing things that are going on at the moment. In terms of specific things, that obviously the big thing that's that just to highlight, I think, just before we go on to that, was the announcement with the Kensington Aldridge Academy, which I think is something I'd just like to recognise as being very important, in fact, that they've moved back to the school. Because this is obviously very much a part of helping to assist in terms of the immediate Lancaster West areas and bring back that community there. We're still suffering from a situation whereby we have quite a large number of homes empty within the Lancaster West estate, and that's important for us to get people back. But there are a number of initiatives all being dealt with locally as far as local schools. I don't know if you've got any specifically to Lancaster West to cover.
I believe you've been to the Cllr, you visited the Cllr recently, so you'll be aware there of some of the opportunities that are there. There's quite a comprehensive summer programme. As a neighbourhood team, we're engaging with the Lancaster West Residents Association, who have set up their own youth forum. So we're providing them with, if you like, sort of the basics that are needed to support them in their own ability to build up the capacity to provide youth facilities. And one of the things we're currently looking to do is to convert an old office on the estate into a community centre. So we've sat down with them. The local authority has granted a budget. They've also been successful in securing charity funding as well. So we are working with them as a residents association to tell us what is needed on the estate. I think at the moment, given what has happened, there's a lot of goodwill aimed towards Lancaster West, and there are a lot of excellent organisations that are offering services. I think our role as a neighbourhood team is making sure those services are reaching the very young people who, given post-traumatic stress disorder is absolutely rife, given 20% of all our residents are under 18. Not everybody is necessarily feeling able to go to the existing centres, if you like. I mean, there's a fantastic leisure centre in the middle of the estate, for example. So I think our role is making sure those services and the services that residents themselves are developing reaches the parts of the community that currently are not being reached.
Thank you. No.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions in relation to diversity of the community that we are talking about. To give a context to the question on diversity, important to put on record that Nottingdale, the ward where the estate is located, the ward itself has some 19.5% community of Black British origin, but the estate itself has 70% residents who are from BAME origin. Often the kind of community who are silent majority. And now coming to the question itself, when we visited the Cllr Community Centre, there was criticism we had that there was lack of understanding of diversity, both historically as well as in the context of dealing with this incident immediately as an immediate response to the fire. Question is, what is the council doing to respond better to the diversity of the communities it serves now and in the future, and how do you, and whether do you appreciate their aspirations and needs?
Okay, if I take that question from a housing point of view, the first thing I think is to understand the community that we're providing services to. I think all public agencies have an obligation to do that. So we've undertaken what we've called a getting to know you exercise, which essentially is a social survey. It's a combination of monitoring forms so that we can collate some of the statistics that Navin, you've mentioned now, but also to learn what are those interactions between the social and physical. So one of the things we've now established is 25% of Lancaster West households are overcrowded. So when we think of what are we doing to the property and the physical infrastructure, we need to consider how can we alleviate that? What are the opportunities for garage conversions, for example, or infills and all that sort of thing. Equally, 10% of households are in properties which aren't accessible to them from a mobility point of view. So of our 12 blocks, only one of them has a lift currently. And even those where there is what you would expect to be flat level access, there's quite a sizable step into a lot of properties. So those really practical things, although quite mundane, are what residents often come in and talk to us about. So one of the things we're doing is introducing a local lettings policy, which we are, rather than submitting an 80-page document to the community and saying, what do you think of this? We're actually presenting a blank sheet of paper where the relevant residents associations have held workshops with independent facilitators. And the good thing is they are then engaged and aware of the dilemmas that we face. Given the paucity of social housing, we can say there is a shortage. So how would you prioritise things? And it's been really interesting to see those very adult-to-adult conversations between what legally are landlords and residents. So I think that certainly helps in terms of how we engage. As part of the discussions we've had, three things have come out to try and shape a neighbourhood strategy in terms of how do we support the social aspect as a housing provider. One is employability, as you mentioned, Sean, and skills. One is health and well-being, which isn't, again, surprising given the context we're operating in. And the other is community cohesion. But what I would say is, compared to other estates I've worked in, the resilience of the Lancaster West community is simply breathtaking, has been key to the fact that I think the community has been as cohesive as it is and relatively engaged and positive and constructive moving forwards. But I think in terms of what we're doing to meet the diverse needs that are apparent, obviously we're considering a range of community development activities, particularly around English as a second language. There are about 5% of households on Lanc West where at least one household member doesn't speak English. Now, the pragmatic way around this is often to discuss with the household members who do speak English, but there are all manner of situations. For example, rent collection, domestic violence, where it's not appropriate to speak to other household members. So by recruiting from the communities that I mentioned earlier on in our discussion, we're able to overcome the language barriers, the literacy barriers, but I think in the Lancaster West context, what's been pivotal is the trust barriers. So for example, by advertising specific drop-ins for our Somali residents and putting in a picture in our monthly newsletter saying, you know, here is a colleague who has come from your community and she's here to engage with you, that has really resonated, and that word of mouth effect has been key, we've found, in publicising that, hey, they're doing things differently. You know, they've actually seemed to be trying here. We've said, you're not meeting our community's needs. They've listened, and let's give this person a chance. And I'd almost say, you know, 2,000 is a lot of residents, but at the same time, it is only 2,000 people. So every positive interaction that our frontline staff have from all the different communities, 25 members of staff, we speak 10 community languages other than English. So every single interaction we have, I think, is starting slowly to move us in the right direction and help us as a public agency to provide services to those who need them. In terms of the refurbishment, we've talked about, if you like, the methodology of engagement, but in terms of some of the outcomes, A couple of examples I'd want to mention is in terms of the demonstration flat, where we essentially said we're costing up all of the ideas. There's a range of kitchens, bathrooms, heating options and so on. Tell us what you like and don't like about each of them. And what comes out is where different strategies, which in their own right have noble aims, sometimes aren't providing what, as users, residents in design terms are essentially users of our properties, aren't providing what is needed. So I'll give an example of something like a sink. So obviously in terms of trying to save water, people are increasingly landlords are putting in smaller sinks. But to your overcrowded family, that is the worst possible thing you can do. So something as simple as saying, oh, well, that's a good point, actually, let's give you larger sinks. Or if they want ablution facilities with wet rooms and so on. So actually by making sure you break down those barriers to people being engaged with you, you actually, we hope, once we get to start doing the physical refurbishment, you'll deliver an outcome that meets the needs of the users and residents.
Just following through before we invite Councillor Taylor-Smith and if Mr. Goldring also wants to come in. You talked about refurbishment, improving facilities, housing angle. You touched upon community cohesion as well. Question is, what kind of social infrastructure that you are providing or have you enhanced for those deprived BME members of community, which makes the majority of their state, particularly older people, because quite rightly, there's focus on the youth, their job opportunities, their welfare, their well-being, their future. But older people in these communities particularly feel isolated. There are major barriers. Are they benefiting in terms of activities that you have nurtured, that you have facilitated to both give them greater confidence as well as isolation and the anxiety they have from what they have faced particularly?
Well, in short, yes. I mean, if you look at us as a borough and look back at our track record in terms of how we are assessed and rated in terms of all forms of care, including most important adult care, then I think we can demonstrate that that's something which we take, obviously, invest a lot of money in and take a lot of support. Specifically in terms of the immediate area of Lancaster West, we have a scheme at the moment which for a new adult social care hub to be located in the which we're now talking to local residents about how that might can be incorporated within wider community work at that one centre. So no, I mean it's something which obviously we look to support and continue to support.
Does that take into consideration cultural, social practices which may be different? The aspirations may be different, either also coming from the faith that they follow. I mean, is it that sensitively managed?
Yes. Again, I mean, we have some very, very good organisations locally, which again we link through to, which cover all cross sections and diversity. And some of the specific spaces we're looking at is looking at providing specific spaces for specific ethnicity groups as well to allow them to have that space. I mean, what we find with a lot of people requests is that, you know, they want to have that identity space themselves provided rather than being into a general community. And that's coming out certainly as far as the initial reviews that are coming back from our asset review.
Mr. Goldring, do you want to add anything?
I'm just saying there is an overall recovery plan which sets out what the offer is, if you like, as we over the next few years in terms of the recovery to the community that's been affected by this terrible tragedy. And I don't know if you've had sight of that.
We haven't. Are we moving?
No, good. One more.
Okay. So that might be something that we could forward on.
Okay, Louise, if you can comment or add to what you heard, and also a question related to GLA and your work, in that, you know, you heard of what is being done by the borough and its partners and local community. Can councils across London, what can they do to understand diversity in their communities better. And a further question being, what can mayor do in terms of strategic work to sort of promote good practices and learning lessons from what is being done in RKB?
Thank you. And I'm really pleased that you asked me to come in on this. I mean, I think I would just like to reinforce the comments from Councillor Taylor-Smith that, we are public agencies. The GLA is by definition a strategic agency. When we work in various boroughs, we always look to the council as the local steward, if you like. We don't presume to know more than them, but we want to work with them. And I think the defining kind of, if I was to distill the places where it works well, it's where you have a good anchor organisation that's perhaps even a level below a local authority. So I spoke about working with the Westway Trust, and the work that we're doing there is designed so that the range of different people in that community get to define what will happen, and will get to get their needs on the table and look at the assets that already exist and how they might be repurposed or how they might be developed to meet the needs and the aspirations of that community. And that's not predefined. That will evolve through the process of working together on it. I think also, just to name check the Portobello Business Centre, who've been so good at, having an even more fine-grained relationship with local businesses and being able to have those relationships and get the help from both ourselves and RBKC out to the business community. And I use that just to demonstrate the characteristic that I think is definitive. And I think we need to be humble, and we need to look for the partners both at the local authority level and within local communities. And an example that I can cite that you will probably be aware of is the Grenfell Centre in Brent, and Kentish Town is a context of significant change. That was a community asset that was being used, but was being used in quite a loose way and in quite a low intensity way. And given the context of change and growth that's happening around, which I appreciate is not the context of West Lancashire Estate, Lancaster, it was about repurposing that and fine-tuning the offer within that building, leveraging that asset, using it to its full extent, and broadening the access beyond an established but quite low intensity use happening in there. And I think that's just a really good example. There are a mix of community, childcare, self-defined community activities, but also workspace in there. And I think we need to be more efficient in how we use assets and how we make sure that they meet the needs of local communities. And we don't presume to know that from City Hall. We work with partners, and I think that's the definition. One thing that I'd say, speaking to your point about what the GLA, what the Mayor can do, as part of, there's a whole range of work that's being looked at by our social policy team, which I won't pretend to be able to summarise, but looking at our core work, the Good Growth Fund, £70 million across 4 years that we have to invest in specific places and specific initiatives. One of the strong steers that we've had set for us by the current administration and by the LEAP is to broaden the range of people that we work with. So, leaning on the good relationships and the strong relationships that we have with the boroughs, but expanding the range of people that we work with. So, if you go back through our programmes, you can track very clearly how we've gone from, zero funding being awarded to civil groups and community-based groups up to, a good third of the organisations. We can check that figure because I'm speaking out from long-term memory here. But, the ramping up of the range of organisations that we engage with and we support, and I think that's a very significant evolution in how we do regen from City Hall. It's going to communities that can help to define from their perspective what's going on and what their objectives are. But it's also, again, speaking to the point about, our public investment, publicly held assets we hold in common and use as groups, need to do more than one job in this day and age. And so it can't be just, it's multifunctional spaces and opportunities that I think are the most compelling in London at the moment. And then one other thing that I would just finally mention is Crowdfund London, which is, a crowdfunding platform that's specifically targeted at community initiatives and community-defined initiatives. And I think that whole range from the mega investments of OPDC or the Olympics through to the ability to influence what's happening in your particular area and to have a role in defining how change happens in your area is a big part of ensuring that people feel part of change rather than that change happens to them or is done to them.
Just one final question,
One
Chair.
tiny.
Very tiny question. Do you think that from RKB experience in the aftermath of the tragic incident, we've learnt enough
For a community, not until the buildings burned down, but people's lives were lost. People's lives were ruined. They've lost confidence in the local council. So how do you start building up that trust, that resilience, right? Those lives of individuals. I haven't heard anything about the mental health of those people, right? I haven't heard about the how do you start putting together, right, those individuals so that they become much more better members of the community, and the community then builds up resilience, right, and the social capital for its future. So what have we done about that? Well, let's start with Idris.
I think I would say on an operational point of view, as I mentioned, we are based on the estate, and you're all welcome to come and see for yourselves in terms of the interaction. So we are entirely open, so when there is somebody at work, residents are welcome to come in. There's no need to make appointments or phone ahead and so on. We're based, actually, we were talking about businesses earlier, we're baseline in a seedbed centre, if you like, Baseline Studios, where there are a number of community organisations, the Residents Association are based as well. I think being approachable and being accountable are paramount in terms of, and I mentioned before about building up conversation by conversation, seeing every inquiry or complaint as an opportunity to actually show, actually, we are public servants, residents pay our wages, we're here for them, which if you speak to residents, and I'm sure you're already aware, that wasn't their perception of the housing services that they were receiving before. In terms of the mental health piece, I think we are still not in a place where we will all public agencies are fully aware of the impact that this is going to have, particularly on the younger people, in terms of trauma manifesting itself later down the line. But the Grenfell recovery strategy is, if you like, a joint strategic needs assessment for that area as a consequence of the disaster. It talks about the ripples. So in terms of, obviously, you have the survivors and bereaved, you have the people who knew somebody who lost somebody, you have the tower blocks on Silchester Estate, but 50 metres away looking at what was unfolding. So the impact that it's having has meant that we can't use, if you like, yesterday's solutions for today's problems. So on a housing management point of view, if you take, for example, some of the families who have moved away and with children, they want to come back, they're asking for certain works to be undertaken to their property, which ordinarily a landlord wouldn't consider. For example, putting up screening on their balconies so their children can't see the tower even though it's covered up. So we're very much devising policies, if you like, but more to the point services in response to what residents are telling us. And I think when you're talking about the scale of what's happened, and we don't have the social housing to necessarily say, don't worry, we'll move you away. So people have been in temporary accommodation for a long time, and hotels, as has been well documented. You are very much forced to be extremely reactive and extremely responsive. And I think the only way you can meet those sorts of needs is almost treating people, on that very human level and taking the time to listen to people. you can't say, oh, I'll check the policy, because there isn't any policy to react to the way that residents need us to support them at this time.
Tom, you want to come in?
I was just saying that, and building upon that, we have the recovery plan, which is something we are consulting with across a number of areas. So it focuses on several key themes concerning young people, jobs and skills, places and spaces, health and well-being, and diversity. Now we've already been out to residents, and they've fed into this, and it's very much with the community that we're developing this, and this will be signed off in totality in the autumn. But it isn't us just saying, right, this is how we're going to, this is what we're going to do for you, and this is how we're going to recover. It's got to come from the people who actually are suffering and dealing with this tragedy on a daily basis.
And how did the NHS respond to this? Did the NHS up his game in terms of making counsellors and psychological therapies? I mean, have you had a good response from the NHS?
Very good. I mean, clearly we work in really close partnership with the NHS, and they've linked through with us, and they've provided tremendous support. And I think just to acknowledge the point that you're making, I mean, this is a lifetime of support that people are going to require. And we can certainly see that there is an escalation as well of PTSD and issues of people being affected by that. But through as the recovery plan, use of the NHS, use of key worker services, use of very much the communities themselves and the community organisations that are there, grant-funded organisations, as they were working in partnership with all of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just for our last two questions, I'll direct these at the Council, Kim Smith. What assurances can the Council give for support to be available for the long term, given that you don't know what those long-term future needs will be? To what extent, I come from RBKC, I was born there, and you have a rich history of, local organisations, Harrow Club, Rugby Club, Pepper Pot, Meanwhile Gardens. To what extent are you looking to use those local organisations to provide the support as well as your own professional staff into the future? Has that been plotted out far into the future?
Far into the future. I mean, this is something we're working on. I mean, finances. I mean, we had a significant amount of. Although I think people always said we had the most reserves as far as any London borough, but I think we were probably ranked about number 7. I think we're probably right at the bottom now. And quite rightly, we've expended the majority of our resources in order to address the immediate impact of the fire, which was a loss of 4% of our housing. And that's put us in a position whereby it's going to be very difficult for us. We are going to need support, and we are going to need that working support with all the organisations. In terms, and we're in the process of putting our latest budgets together. But we've costed that within the short-term horizon. But it is a concern to us, and it's something we're going to have to look at moving further out in terms of the long term.
Okay. How will the Council use and share the learning it's acquired through the residents-led approach in Lancaster West in particular, the refurbishment process as well? How will you roll that approach out to other estates? Like, what was very interesting, you talked about overcrowding, James, you talked about overcrowding. But so does that lead me to believe you will be building additional space on the estate, or is...
That's something that's come from the Ideas Day, so that's something that residents have talked about. There's a range of garages. We've talked about top hatting on some blocks, and also in terms of identifying opportunities for infill. So at this stage they're sort of ideas. So we're looking at the costings, we're looking at the implications. Some of them will cause more disruption than others. And the thing I would say as well is the learning for Lancaster West won't necessarily be as applicable to other estates. So because of the mental health issues, even something like upgrading somebody's kitchen, we're finding is a far more disruptive and traumatic experience than would ordinarily be the case. And of course, social housing, has a range of issues facing it currently, largely, I believe, due to a shortage of the supply of it. And of course, we've inherited a diverse range of residents who have a range of challenges. So we have a number of residents who are older, and I mentioned accessibility, so they're living with a greater range of disabilities as well. So I think what we are certainly learning, though, is the need to engage with residents and listen to them, and at least be seen to explore their ideas, rather than sort of take a sort of a paternalistic approach of, no, we're not going to do that, we're not, you know, because that won't work here. Even if, from experience, myself and other colleagues think actually in the long term that's not going to work. But Doug can probably talk about how it might apply to the wider borough.
Certainly my learning since I've been here is that actions are the only thing that really matter.
Okay, that's interesting comment.
Ultimately, we're dealing with a group of residents, not just on Lancaster West, but across the borough, who have, absolutely zero trust in authority, and certainly the local authority, in terms of delivering housing services. And when you're starting in that context, you have to plan in a much more organised way, and actually understand that things you want to bring in and things that you want to do to deliver improvements will take you longer, but you'll bring the residents who are paying for that service and the recipients of that service with you. That has been a different way of looking at every aspect of the services that we deliver. And at the moment, we are working with a large number of residents across the borough in terms of shaping what those services will look like in the future, and what things matter to them, and that will be within the context of our current delivery, and clearly financial constraints and the rest of it. But it will be very much something which will be. We won't be able to. We're not in a position where we can ever make a decision without actually consulting with the residents who will receive the changes in those decisions first. And that I suppose is usually there's a modicum of trust in the delivery, and so as a landlord you're often able to make those decisions and say where you're going because it seems reasonable. Whilst in this context, it feels that we're not in that position, and actually we are very much discussing right from every, from the selection of small contractors such as who carries out the satisfaction survey, to wider issues with our residents now, and that is a sea change, if you like, in terms of the delivery at RBKC.
Just to add to that, as I say, Doug's hit, in terms of trust, I mean, the big two areas for us is one in terms of how housing was managed, and that was managed remotely, and also there were quite a few regeneration schemes that were in contemplation on a number of the key estates, which were causing great anxiety. And I think the two things that, trust has to be earned, and we have to keep demonstrating that. I think I mentioned earlier, one of the things in terms of now having the direct responsibility for housing, so that we can be transparent, we can, they can come to meetings and we reinstate in all the meetings. And I think that's a really important component part, and people have welcomed that. And I welcome the fact that all of our tenant consultancy meetings now are increasing, and more people are coming and different people are coming. So I think that's one way of restoring that. As far as the procurement of additional housing is concerned, we put a stop on all regeneration immediately in the immediate aftermath, stopped everything and have reaffirmed that. And it saddens me that people still have that fear, even though I've written to people, we've spoken in council meetings talking about no regeneration. People still think that there must be this sort of hidden agenda, and that's something which hopefully with what we're doing at Lancaster West will help restore and give those people that view and that little bit more confidence. But it is going to take an awful lot of time. As far as how we're going to deliver and address our housing shortage within the borough and our long list of people that wanting to move to the borough, we again have been doing an exercise not just on council owned land where we can do infill and improvement, but also where we might be able to work with third parties, and we're looking at our housing planning in terms of how we apply our planning for on-site development rather than taking money to spend because we don't have the sites available for it. And I'm quite encouraged, and that's something we will talk about in greater detail at one of the forthcoming council meetings is to set out what we believe our ability is in terms of delivering the longer term housing for the borough. But it's fair to say, and it goes back to your earlier question, it's something we're going to have to look at quite carefully in terms of viability and being able to do that moving forward.
Yes. I think that brings us to the end of our formal questions, unless any of our guests have a comment or a closing statement they'd like to make. Okay, I'd just like to say this. I think actually, James, just to push back a little bit, I think your team is doing quite a good job and does have a lot of lessons that it could be giving to people. The way in which you're interacting with people, I know this because some of my friends live on this stage. I'm sure. We have the conversation. I actually think it's tough for you, it's tough for the residents, but there's learning there that other housing teams across the country, forget just London, could actually learn from. And the interaction between yourselves, the residents, and our rich tapestry of voluntary organisations should be built and learnt, because I think in the future that will be the mechanism that carries the residents for 10, 15, 25 years, because ultimately, in my opinion, the residents are going to want and need a certain level of responsibility and autonomy in order to build trust. If they're constantly done to and done for, they may not ever get there. Doug, did you want to say something?
No, I mean, it makes you reevaluate what the role of a landlord is.
Yes.
And I think the history of landlords doing things to the residents without involving them is a lesson learnt here where we need to change.
Because I think your proudest thing, both yourselves and the council, you are building capacity in these communities so they have the understanding and the ability to rightly ask the right questions and challenge in the right way to get changes that they want. That is a legacy that will have impact in the future. But that brings us to the end of our formal discussion. Can I thank our guests for their attendance and their very helpful contributions to the discussion. Can we agree the recommendations set out in the report?
Agreed.
Excuse me? Can we confirm the minutes of our last meeting?
Yes.
Have I got my wrong one? One of these days. Can we all agree the recommendations set out in the report? The date of our next meeting will be Wednesday the 10th of October 2018 at 10 o'clock in Chamber.
Chair, before you hit the gravel, can I bring something under any other business?
Of course you can. I haven't actually got to any other business. That's next.
Okay.
But just let me finish. Let me say that again. The date of our next meeting will be the 10th of October at 10 o'clock in the Chamber in the morning. Any other business?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I know there was a visit by the committee to the community centre, I think it was. Yes. But unfortunately, we were only given 24 hours notice for that meeting, and it was in the middle of our August holidays. And I just wanted to put on record that some members couldn't come along there because it was just not convenient for us to do so, right? And I know there may have been logistic problems, but I just want to put it on record. That's why we weren't there, okay? There, and then that while the two members were able to come.
Okay.
I just extend an invitation if you wish to make a separate appointment. We'll be very happy to accommodate.
That's very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to put on the record the nature of the situation concerning Grenfell meant that the visit was very, very difficult to arrange, and that made it an extraordinarily complex situation, and that's why some of those changes happened. But unless anybody else has any other business, I have no urgent business.
GLA Chamber